So my name's Tina Fawcett. I'm the convener of the Oxford Energy Network. Welcome for this event. This is the third last one of this term. Before introducing today's speaker, I'm just going to mention a few other things that are happening, and then we'll move on to the main event. So we've got two more seminars this term, which are at the same time in the same place. So sort of next Tuesday, we've got Peter Vance, who's an energy and sort of battery entrepreneur and business person. We haven't actually got the title of his talk yet, but we're assured by people who know him that he's a very good speaker and it will be really interesting. So hopefully that's enough encouragement to come along. And then week 8, so the week after that, we're going to have a panel discussion on aviation, energy perspectives from an expert panel. As it's the last one of term, we're also going to have sort of nibbles at the end. And hopefully we'll have a lively debate rather than a fight about what we think about aviation. Another event that is coming up is we've got a Zero and Oxford Energy Network lunch this term, which is on the 20th of June in the East Lab, so in this building, from 12 to 2 p.m. Some of you might have been before. It's sort of an informal gathering. There'll be very brief talks by me and the head of the Zero Institute, Paul Shearing, just telling you what we've been getting up to in recent times, and there'll be a sort of open space for anybody to talk about any events that they've got coming up or any projects they'd like to bring people's attention to, any bits of news. So it's a sort of community gathering, bit of networking, a nice free lunch. And we're asking that people register by the 16th of June to make sure we get the catering right. And if you look on the Zero website, so zero.ox.ac.uk, you'll find the sort of sign up sheet there. Two more, final thing is that, as you might have noticed, we're in the middle of Right Here, Right Now, or it's just starting. So it's a global event on climate change and human rights, which Oxford University is part of. There's events have already been happening this week. It's being launched tomorrow at the Sheldonian, sort of 8 to 10 p.m. And then on Thursday, there's events during the day. Friday, there's a late night at the museum. There's all sorts of things. If you haven't come across it, I suggest you have community events that are happening throughout Oxford. And unfortunately, I'm double booked onto another Right Here, Right Now event that I'm helping lead. So I'm going to rather rudely leave this seminar early, but there's a lot going on. So we've got to put all that aside. Today, we're very lucky to welcome Christina Dembski from the University of Bath. As you can see, she's got her title up there. She's going to be talking about public attitudes towards energy infrastructure and technologies, and the subtitle was Why It Matters What People Think and Feel About the Energy Transition. Christina's a reader in environmental psychology. She's also Deputy Director at the Centre for Climate Change and Social Transformations, which you might know as CAST, and she's the Associate Director of the Bath Institute of Sustainability and Climate Change. She completed her PhD on public acceptance of renewable energy in 2011, has specialised in public perceptions and engagement with climate and energy issues ever since. So we're delighted that she's here. I'm going to hand over to Christina now.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. Yeah, so it's when I wrote the abstract, I didn't 100% know exactly what I'll talk about today, but hopefully you'll enjoy the topics that I've chosen. It's a very broad topic, obviously, but thank you very much for that kind introduction. I thought I'd start with just a broad introduction to the kinds of research that I've been doing since doing my PhD, just to get a bit broader sense, because I don't just do work on energy technologies. I also do a lot of work on climate. So I've done quite a bit of work on understanding climate impacts and perceptions and experiences of those, and interesting also around climate adaptation. And then as part of the CAST Centre, which Tina mentioned, I've done more work on low carbon lifestyles and climate mitigation, trying to understand kind of feasible and desirable low carbon futures, lots of public perspectives and engagement within that. But today I'm going to talk about this kind of middle bit, which is more around energy technologies and transitions. A lot of that work has been part of the UK Energy Research Centre over the years. Generally, all of this work is trying to summarize what I'm actually about, but generally all of it is trying to understand what do we mean by public acceptance and the importance of public perspectives in decision making and policy. So today I'm going to focus on kind of 3 broad topics. I thought I'd start with the general rationale for why public engagement with energy and climate issues is important, a little bit on the how, what, when and who, although that's probably a whole nother talk. And then the kind of second topic is really broadly what some of the research I've been involved in understanding public attitudes or public acceptance of energy transitions, and also infrastructure kind of technologies more specifically. Again, that'll be quite broad. I've been involved in various things, and I should also acknowledge that it's a huge field and there's lots of scholars producing lots of really interesting work in the space. And so I'm going to focus a little bit on mostly what I've done, but drawing on other people's work as well. And then I'll do a quick deep dive into the most recent work that we did as part of UKirk, which is looking at kind of domestic heat decarbonisations and public attitudes towards. Okay, so starting with why should we care about public engagement with energy? And I thought, and again, this brought me right back to my PhD, which I kind of enjoyed. It was a long time ago, but I did a lot of reading back then, obviously. And there was a nice paper in Public Understanding of Science in the kind of early 2000s. People started thinking about the kind of rationales for public understanding, and this in particular around science and technology. And these authors essentially summarized the history of thinking in this space. And in the 60s, there was a lot of focus on the deficit model of public understanding of science, and this idea that people just don't know enough. So once they have the right knowledge and information, they will accept or have the right attitude, according to technical experts, let's say, in the energy field. It's kind of more rationalist approach to decision making, that there is one rational answer, and people just need to have the right information to get to that answer. That's been kind of widely discredited, although I have to say there are still remnants of this within kind of policy making along a lot of other issues. Then the literature sort of moved on in the 80s to what they call public understanding of science, which is kind of, there's still ideas around, you know, we need education and so on, but it's more of a focus on attitudes rather than knowledge. This idea that people are having kind of negative attitudes and we need to address them and make them more positive. So there was more of a focus on persuasion. And this is where a lot of, in the energy field, for example, NIMBYism and so on, this is where it originates. And then in the 90s, they've called this new paradigm called science and society, which is more of a constructivist view of public understanding of science, and they've really focused on the kind of public stakeholder interactions around, for example, energy or technology issues, and this idea that there's a lack of trust. And if you increase the interactions between different groups of people, and particularly stakeholders and publics, that will improve trust, and through that, there will be more public acceptance of science and technology. I'd be interested to see what the original authors think about where we're at now, or whether there's a fourth paradigm, but I'll leave that open. But also move on to my next slide, which is related, and you will see similar themes, but it's a slightly different kind of literature, which is thinking about the different rationales for public engagement. I kind of, you know, this has been a long history. You can see some of the references there. Again, in the 90s, early 2000s, people started publishing on this and articulating why we should engage the public. And generally, there are kind of three rationales that people talk about. One is the instrumental rationale, which is essentially we should engage as a means to improve perceptions. So this is very kind of similar to one of the second paradigm that I just presented. And essentially, engagement is a way for you to, or for stakeholders to signal their commitment to what people care about. And also, there's an element of improving the transparency of decisions that are made, for example, around technology or infrastructure. There's a little bit of a criticism around this rationale that it's really, you're just doing the engagement to get people to accept what you want them to accept. And so the substantive rationale is kind of a response to that, which is you should engage as a means to actually improve the decisions. So for example, this is very prominent in policy making. You know, you can get people involved as active decision makers and designing, for example, of policies, or just giving you information that's important, I mean, fair, or policies that are responsive to what people actually care about. And so it's kind of considering perspectives from different groups that might be affected to be able to inform decisions, for example, on local contexts where a development might be happening. And then there's this sort of third rationale, which is more, I think, more based on sort of more ethical or legal disciplines, which is this idea that, you know, engagement is a democratic right. It's the right thing to do because people are going to be affected by these decisions, so they should be engaged. And that kind of underpins some of these frameworks. For example, the UN ACE framework, which is around action for climate empowerment and this kind of right for people to be engaged in different ways. So that's kind of the literature that underpins a lot of the why should we engage people in the first place, and some of the kind of critical perspectives on some of these rationales. And it's kind of an idealistic view, whether this actually happens, you know, whether people aim people's aims for public engagement align with these is still open for debate. But I thought I would summarize it briefly in terms of the public engagement with climate and energy, and I present this a lot, and this is how a lot of my presentations start, is providing the rationale for why we should engage people with climate and energy issues. And it goes something like this. We need deep and rapid emission reductions, and we can no longer kind of make progress on this without broader societal transformations that actually impact on people's lives and involve people. So people are at the heart of those changes, so we need to engage them. And specifically in energy systems, if you think about it, people have multiple different roles. These are not exhaustive, but we often talk about the fact that people have voting powers. So that's one way that they can exercise kind of their concerns. We're also active, oftentimes also kind of passive proponents or opponents of things. We think about kind of citing renewable energy, for example, and we are all energy users and increasingly energy. So there's different ways that we're implicated in the energy system, but they all point to the fact that we need to be included in decision making. So a lot of my kind of research is premised on this idea that we need early and meaningful engagement. And I tend to distinguish between two different reasons. One is we need people involved in the delivery of changes. So we need people to actually adopt energy technologies in their homes or reduce their energy use. But we also want people to be involved in the decision making on how we're going to go about changing or transforming our societies to be more, to reach net zero, for example. So there's two tracks and two reasons why to get people involved. And we've published on this in different ways. So there's a CAST briefing if you're interested. But essentially, it kind of mirrors some of the rationales that I mentioned there. It's important to develop, let's say, interventions or policies or technologies, if that's what you're interested in, to account for what people care about, what people are concerned about, and what their experiences are. And I'll show you some examples of why that's important. And obviously, it's also still important to foster legitimacy, trust, and a sense of kind of collective action and fairness. And again, I'll give you some examples of how I think that's important. So if we get all of this right, technically, we should have a strong social mandate for change and also successful delivery, because if we get it wrong, obviously people are not going to be on board with some of these changes, and we make some of these changes. I promised a couple of slides on the kind of what, how, and who. And again, some of you might be more familiar with this, but when we talk about public engagement, there's a kind of move towards the word engagement can mean lots and lots of different things, and probably you all have different ideas of what it might mean. But there's also a lot of talk about public participation specifically, and this is more this idea of involving people in decision making. There's kind of the famous Einstein ladder participation, and he talks about, there are kind of non-participation examples, which are essentially this idea of like manipulating or persuading people with dubious means, all the way up to giving citizens control in the actual decision-making situation. And there's other versions of this. On the left, you can see here, people often talk about different kind of levels of participation, from just informing people about something, which is a little bit more aligned with, sometimes people need to know information because they don't necessarily know something, but it certainly won't get you to, what we know that it doesn't necessarily get people to change that. And again, show you examples of that, all the way to empowering people to make decisions. There's another way that people have been talking about this, and again, probably most of you will be familiar with this. This idea of moving from one-way communication or one-way engagement to more two-way engagement. So one-way engagement might be surveys where people or publics provide information to stakeholders, or the other way around, which is like your communication campaigns that we're all used to, where again, stakeholders are providing information to the public, but there's no interaction. And then also this idea of two-way engagement, which in theory, depending on how it's done, could kind of foster a more collaborative kind of decision-making relationship and trust. And there are different ways of doing this, and there might be some that you're more, I mean, so I have another slide that I didn't include here. There's lots and lots of examples of what that might mean. But one that's been quite kind of become a bit famous over the last few years is this idea of citizens' juries, or citizens' assemblies, where people get together and deliberate on particular issues. So the climate assembly happened in 2020, 21, something like that. There's been, and I've done quite a lot of work on that as well. So we're happy to have a chat about climate assemblies. And then there's this third idea that one-way and two-way engagement is often very kind of invited forms of engagement, where stakeholders decide what the topic is or who's invited and so on. But there's also this idea that we should focus on emergent or more creative engagement, where communities or people get together themselves to advocate for an issue or make changes. So for example, in Manchester, there's kind of a community group that's trying to make streets safer and reduce air pollution and so on. So there's this idea that it's kind of more grassroots action. And all of this also kind of relates to this idea of inclusivity and diversity within engagement, which is, again, talked about a lot, but there's still much to be researched. So there are questions about who participates and where. So this is particularly relevant to kind of more invited forms of participation, where someone gets to decide who's invited and who participates. And this idea that perhaps we need more bespoke spaces for underserved or marginalized communities, because often they don't have a voice in some of this decision making. But then there's also questions around, for example, I mean, this is a particular bugbear of mine, in spaces like climate assemblies, there's a lot of focus on having representative people take part, but representative, what does that mean? In what context? Can people actually engage equally if they're coming from different backgrounds? So there's a lot of questions here about what inclusivity and diversity and engagement means. So I've just thought I'd at least mention that rather than, again, one other presentation. And then again, just to put my 2 cents in on when to engage. And again, this probably won't be a surprise to many, that my view is that we need early and continuous engagement. So particularly around kind of energy infrastructure, or I've got some work going on kind of decarbonizing industry. So we need engagement all the way through from the innovation process to delivery. Oftentimes we think engagement when all the decisions have been made and the technology is being cited, or industry is making some big change, and it's almost perhaps too late to engage at that point, because we need to open up discussions to kind of broader questions about why something's being done and how something's being done, rather than just focusing on where exactly the scientific and technical details. And that also is really important, because then it becomes more anticipatory rather than reactive. A lot of the times engagement happens in a way where there's a problem, so it's reactive to a challenge that happens. And there's lots of examples where actually poor engagement or no engagement has led to projects being pulled, for example. So that's my kind of 2 cents on why I think public engagement is important, and a little bit on how and when and who. I will focus now a little bit more on acceptance of energy transitions and the work that I've done within that. And I think a lot of my work fits under, if you remember, the adaptive rationale, this idea of understanding public perspectives so we can feed them into decision making. So I think that's where a lot of my research fits in terms of kind of scientific inquiry. Okay, so one of the things that I guess spans across some of my work is I spend a lot of time thinking about what do we mean by public acceptance of energy, and I've done a lot of work on kind of public preferences. I've done loads of surveys on kind of favourable or unfavourable views towards different types of energy technologies and so on. But I think across all of that, it's really important to understand that kind of public views on energy issues can be really complex and diverse, and they can shift and they evolve over time. So your surveys tend to give you kind of a snapshot, and sometimes you can find consistent trends. So I've just pulled this off the Climate Barometer Tracker webpage. I don't know if you can see it, but these are just kind of to what extent would you support or oppose the following being built in your area? And we have that for onshore wind farms and solar energy parks. And generally, I mean, there's dips and goes up and down, but we've known for over a decade, there's generally favourable views towards wind and solar energy development, generally. So there are some consistent trends that we can find. But even in this case, where general support or favourability for an energy technology is high, it doesn't mean the public acceptance is guaranteed, even if people are saying they would accept them in the area. So it's really important to understand how that kind of general support might or might not translate to actual acceptance in a particular context. And we often talk about kind of conditional support and this idea that people are supportive, but that doesn't mean they don't have concerns. So for us, it's really important to understand what those conditions or concerns might be. And oftentimes we won't be able to know the exact concerns until you're in a particular context and a particular time. But there are some things that we can learn that help us anticipate some of those. I also just took the opportunity to put this lovely fancy graph or figure I created in my PhD, which is where I initially talked about this. And this is the idea that actually, if you look at surveys, and this isn't talked about very much, most people are somewhere in the middle. So you have people who strongly support wind farms and think it's great, and there's not a lot of conditions attached to that support. And then you have maybe the 10-20% that have strong fundamental opposition to the technology. But most people are kind of in the middle here somewhere. And they have some sort of conditions attached to their support. And sometimes they're stricter and more defined, and sometimes they're a little bit nebulous, and it really depends. So again, it's just to say that, surveys give you a little bit of a snapshot, and it is important to see the consistent trends, and that there is, to use the word social mandate, to look into these technologies to use them. But that doesn't mean people don't have conditions or ambivalence around these. The other way to think about public preferences and public support for energy transitions and technologies that I often use is sometimes, so for kind of wind and solar, they're very well-known technologies. People know what we're talking about when we ask about them on surveys, but there's lots of elements of the energy transitions or technologies or new ways of doing things that people don't really know very much about. And in that kind of situation, public attitudes are not very well formed. They're not fully formed, and they're often dependent on the context. So there's lots of studies that show, for example, on geoengineering, that if you frame the technology in different ways, you can affect how people think about the technology. So these are really important to kind of keep in mind when we're looking at what public preferences of energy transition. And again, it doesn't mean that we can't know anything about them and that they're completely fickle and they change all the time, but it's about understanding what might inform our preference. So we did some work on understanding what people care about a long time ago, but I always like to pull this out again. And as part of UKIRC, so we did a big public project on public acceptance of energy system change. So we looked at supply side and demand side changes. And I don't have time to go into all of the details, but one of the things that we did was produce a report that kind of synthesized across all of the different data or like methods that we use. So we used quantitative surveys, we used kind of extensive deliberative qualitative work, we used kind of energy scenario modeling and so on. And we looked at what people said was important to them in terms of energy transitions and the different elements of it. And I've just kind of collated them here. And again, if you have been part of UKIRC, you will have probably seen this 10 years ago. But we kind of clustered people's concerns, or we called them kind of value clusters, into these 6 clusters around efficiency and not being wasteful, caring about the environment and nature, clearings, like being secure and stable, having some autonomy and power, but also thinking about how the process is done and how change happens, and this idea of having just and fair transitions. And there's a lot more underlying all of this. And again, I won't go into all of the details, but you can see some of the more specific ways that people thought about them. So for example, if you think about the kind of security value sets, it includes concerns around safety and reliability of, for example, technologies, and particularly new technologies, but it also related a lot around kind of personal security and being able to access energy, for example, and this idea of, having affordable and available energy. Autonomy and freedom was important to people, not that, decisions are just imposed on them, but that they have some choice and control within decision making. Some more general values here around how decisions are made about energy transitions, and this idea that we should think about long term rather than just short term. So this is kind of a comment on kind of how the political system makes decisions around energy transitions, and various others. And I was going to focus a little bit on the last one here around justice and fairness, because ever since we've done this work, actually, we've done lots of other projects, and kind of justice and fairness concerns come up over and over and over again. And there's been a lot of focus on it since. So again, I'm going to present like a couple of slides on this, but there's a whole literature that kind of relates to the kind of what does a just and fair transition look like, and it's still a very live issue. But it was neat that it was a very important value cluster that we found for this as well. And again, this probably won't be a surprise to many of you in the room. There's lots of different ways that we can think about justice and fairness. But generally, this idea of perceived fairness, so if you're thinking about public perspectives, has been found really in different ways. We've done some work on, for example, support for net zero policies, and perceived fairness was by far the largest predictor, for example. Generally, it comes up over and over again. There's lots of different ways to think about justice, and again, there's a whole literature around those, but the 2 kind of main ways of thinking about fairness that come up relate to procedural and distributive justice, which I've put on the screen here. So one example, again, just pointing back to the Climate Assembly, they were asked to think about kind of considerations for kind of our net zero transformation or transition, and fairness was the second most important principle that the kind of assembly came up with as a guiding kind of principle for decision makers. So it comes up over and over again. Another example, and I don't know if you can see it here, so I'll just talk it through. So another example of a project that we did following this work was on energy storage and thinking about flexibility within the energy system and different ways to meet that flexibility need that comes with having more renewable energy in the system. And within that, we found justice and fairness concerns dominated how people were evaluating different ways of meeting that flexibility. Might it be through kind of different forms of technological energy storage, or different kind of new governance mechanisms where people are reacting, for example, or there's an automated system of dealing with it. And again, there's lots of tables in the paper, but for example, distributive justice concerns came out across lots of different groups. One of them that's very prominent is always concerned with vulnerable groups and to what extent they can engage with new technologies, new governance systems, to what extent they're left behind or disadvantaged in some way, and this idea that it could drive further inequality. So again, this isn't necessarily new, I think, but it's just to make the point that it comes up over and over again when you think about what people think about in terms of what makes a good energy transition. Another example, this was another UK project that we did, and again, we did a lot of follow-ups in terms of understanding people's perspectives. We did some quantitative work and some qualitative work, and I'll just talk you through here. We did a survey looking at acceptance of cost on energy bills associated with low carbon policies. These are some of the things that are on our energy bills to pay for more environmental things. And we added at some examples. And what we essentially found that people's personal financial circumstances, so why their bills were, how what their income and how concerned they were about the energy costs as well, were not predictive of their acceptance of cost, but our questions on more justice and fairness and trust indicators were predictive of people's acceptance of cost. So essentially what we concluded is that how fair people think the system is more predictive of them accepting costs and energy bills than their financial circumstances, which is quite surprising in my view. We did a lot of qualitative work as well, and what came out very strongly is that that related a lot to the energy actors within that system, because that, and particularly energy companies, because they issue the bills. And again, this won't be surprising to you that there's a lot of distrust in energy companies. Be interested to see, at the time we were sort of saying this is very different in other types of utilities, for example, water companies, but that's probably changed. But yeah, there's a lot of concerns around distributive justice. So this idea that, well, there is this misperception that energy companies make a lot of profit, and under those circumstances, it's not fair to have those costs on bills. Energy companies need to reduce their profits first. And interestingly, even if you said to people, well, actually profits are not that high, they don't necessarily believe that information. So there's this more procedural justice issue here. It's like, well, even if their profits are not that high, they're hiding the profits that they're making. So there's a lot of distrust in the energy system, which impacts on whether people are willing to accept, for example, in this case, costs. Okay. And then just the last slide on this section, I wanted to show that there is lots of work by lots of other good people. So Hilary Bidet wrote in Nature Energy, trying to summarize all the things that might impact on responses to new energy technologies. And she used lots of different theories, more individual level theories that explain behavior of individuals, to more system level social theories. I've just put them here so you have a reference here. But what you can see is she divided the factors that impact on people's responses in 4 boxes. One more related to technology, one more related to people as individuals and within their social environment, one around process and how things are done, and then one which is more around place. And I haven't talked about place very much at all, but you can see some of the other things that I've mentioned prop up along here. So, for example, how technologies and the risks and benefits are perceived, but actually what our research has shown is that the process is really, really important, and that's where justice and fairness values come in. If you're more interested in getting a holistic view, this is a really great paper to read as a summary. Running out of time, so I'll be really quick on my last section, which is why I thought I'd do a little bit more of a deep dive rather than a general overview, just presenting the work that we've done on domestic low carbon heating technologies. Again, this is a UCA project. There's a nice little report that you can have a look at, and Will Smith, who's the postdoc on the project, also published this paper this year. I'll go through this quite quickly. So just a little bit of background. Again, this probably won't be news to you. Decarbonising domestic heat is a vital part of achieving net zero, and actually it relies significantly on demand side changes. We've done a lot on the supply side, but really we need to get people involved if we're going to get these demand side changes done as well. And there's been some mixed success across Europe. So recently, past colleagues of mine did some analysis of the backlash that was experienced in Germany around heat pumps. So again, if you're interested in that, really interesting read. At the time when we did this research, so this was in 23, the situation was a little bit different. We had a different government, the incentives were a bit different, but so far not that much has changed. So I think it's still relatively relevant. But generally the policy on domestic heat has been let the consumer decide, with a little bit of supportive policy in terms of incentives. But there hasn't been a lot of engagement around the need to move away from fossil fuel heating to low carbon heating. There certainly hasn't been many politicians, for example, on TV saying that there's a need to do this. So unsurprisingly, we knew prior to doing this research that there was low awareness of low carbon heating technologies or the need for change. And also we know that people really like their gas boilers. So those two things in combination didn't make a good starting point, but see what we found. Briefly on the method, I'll give you a bit more detail here. It was a nationally representative survey. We wanted to know generally public attitudes towards different technologies. It was done in 2023, and we looked at particularly heat pumps, hydrogen heating, and district heating or heat networks. And we had different sections of the survey, general questions on whether they're supportive of using these technologies generally, willingness to adopt it in their own homes. We also had this, what we call the informed choice or decision pathway element, which is essentially we gave people scenarios to kind of question whether those scenarios might change their willingness to engage with the technology, but I'll give you more information about that in a second. And then a bunch of contextual variables. And again, if you read the report, there's more information on how they affected people's willingness, but I'll give you some examples as well. So the informed choice element, essentially what we did, summarized here, we provided people with some information about the technology, and it looked a bit like this. So we had an information sheet which had information on kind of general technology, what it does, installation costs, running costs, how to use it, technological readiness, environmental impact, levels of disruption. So we kind of standardized it. We tried to include kind of relatively neutral information. And after we gave people that information, we asked them about how willing they were to consider using that technology. We contextualized it a little bit. So for example, for renters, we asked them, if your landlord is thinking about installing this, would you be willing to have it? Or we would ask, your boiler broke, would you be willing to consider a heat pump? Or there is a hydrogen trial in your area, would you be willing to be part of it? So we kind of contextualized it a bit to be realistic. And then we had a bunch of, after we asked the initial willingness questions, we had a bunch of kind of probing scenarios, positive and negative. So for example, what if there was a larger incentive, or what if you found out you had to change all your radiators? So kind of positive and negative kind of prompts to see whether they make any difference in terms of willingness. And yeah, people got to reassess their willingness. Just a bit of information on the sample. I actually looked at the slide this morning, and I don't actually know what these refer to, but I can look it up if anyone's interested. But just so you have some sample information on, it's broadly nationally representative on region, age, gender, and education. Okay, so quick run through of the findings. So in terms of awareness and knowledge, again, you don't have to read all of this, but essentially what this slide shows is that generally the knowledge, so most people have kind of heard and know a little bit about the need to transition to low carbon heating technologies, and they've heard a little bit about hydrogen heat pumps and district heating, but it's not a lot of kind of subjective knowledge. And actually, I think heat pumps were the people were most aware of heat pumps and least aware of kind of district heating. We also asked to what extent people thought different kind of behaviors or actions that they could take in their own lives would contribute to reducing carbon emissions. And this, again, has been asked quite a lot of times, and we have other survey data to show this, is that it always kind of is, you know, using low carbon heating is kind of recognized as something important to do to reduce carbon emissions, but never as high as things like more transport choices or generally just reducing energy use in your home. Although there are some things that people are even less aware of. So for example, reducing red meat in your diet. So again, it's a kind of middle of the road. And again, I think if we redid it, I wonder if it's starting to change. So this will be something that we'll keep an eye on. So the summary is that the majority of respondents know at least something about low carbon heating technologies, but there's not really any kind of in-depth knowledge. And they also see low carbon heating as less important compared to other things that they might do to tackle climate change. So how does that translate to support for different types of technologies? And here we can see that I think the purple and browns on this side support, and this side is opposed, and you can see the summaries at the top. And essentially, most people are generally supportive of these technologies after receiving some information, and they think they're useful to use in an energy transition. And I think in this case, hydrogen and heat pumps receive more support than district heat. So again, we see clear support. This is kind of a positive news story, I suppose. But it's really important to say that there is also ambivalence. And again, this is related to this idea of people don't have clear, strong support or opposition to these technologies because they don't know that much about them. And again, there's more information here, but generally people feel kind of positive about them. So when we talk about affect, it's just this general positive feeling that people get. They perceive somewhat more benefits than risks for these technologies, and they were also somewhat willing to adopt them. And I've summarized the kind of willingness here. You can see that majority of people are at least willing to consider having them in their homes. And that's the kind of same for heat pumps and hydrogen, a little bit lower for heat networks. Okay, then we get onto the informed choice results. And again, there is quite a clear story here. So again, I can give you more information on the exact scenarios we used. We kind of summarized them here. But if you look at the top, these are the kind of, for heat pumps, these are the 4 positive scenarios we gave people. So we said, what if we told you there's kind of 24 support and lots of warranties associated with your heat pumps? What if you actually realize that there's lower costs associated with heat pumps and various things? And what you can see here is generally positive scenarios have a positive effect on willingness, and negative scenarios have a negative effect on willingness. But what's interesting here is that it's split by their initial willingness. So essentially, people who are willing to adopt a heat pump are more willing to adopt a heat pump when they see the positive scenarios. And if you're unwilling to adopt a scenario, you're even more unwilling to adopt a heat pump after you read the scenarios. And then we find that repeated across the other technologies. So you can see the same for district heating and hydrogen. The pattern remains the same. So essentially what we see here is kind of an effective belief bias. People are interpreting the scenarios, and where they're just seeing the scenarios kind of confirm their existing beliefs. And again, that's in line with what we would expect from kind of psychological theory. We also wanted to then understand a little bit more about what's actually affecting willingness. And there's a lot more to say here, and I couldn't include it all. But again, people who are willing to adopt some of these technologies are generally more concerned about energy security, and they're also more concerned about, or they have strong environmental values. And again, that's in line with the theory on this, because currently we're in a very hypothetical scenario, and these technologies, people are not making real decisions. So more general values around energy security, environmental values might impact those decisions, but that might change when we become more concrete in our decision making. What we also found was really interesting was this, what we call the social circle effect. We could probably call it something else. We had this one question on the survey which just asked whether people know one person or more people who have a heat pump. And that question alone increased willingness over and above or controlling for some of the other factors. So this idea that the people around you adopting heat pumps, that makes you more willing to adopt a heat pump, and some thoughts why that might be, and we can talk about that. And just included this slide because Will did some lovely kind of network modeling and some fancy statistical analysis, which please don't ask me to explain in detail, but it confirmed the social circle effect. So when you put all these different variables into kind of like a network model to describe the attitude structure, the R in the middle here is the social circle, kind of the social question that we had, and it just connected a lot of the other variables. So again, it comes out as a very positive influence across the attitude network found. And then last but not least, we had some questions around trust, responsibility and fairness. And again, this is something we're always interested because of how strongly it came out in our original work on this. And this won't be a surprise to you again if you've read around this area, but government energy companies were viewed as more responsible than householders, but they were also not trusted necessarily to provide consistent information or involving people in decision making. So in that sense, the kind of energy system actors are kind of a little bit of an issue in terms of trust and fairness. And that also plays out in policy support. So we asked some policy support questions, And generally people are supportive. Again, just like generally the technology support, we can see people are supportive of policies around this. But what's interesting is that, well, perhaps not surprising, people are most supportive of policies that provide them with money, so subsidies, and less that take away choice and control, which is the ban on gas and oil boilers. And it also mirrors the kind of responsibility finding, because the kind of subsidy is more of a government responsibility or government policy, whereas the ban is more affects individuals more directly. Okay, and then just that leaves me to conclude. Just to summarize, we think, or we know from this research, but also previous research, awareness is pretty limited around low carbon heating technologies. I don't know if anyone has views on this. I do think the discourse on this is changing, the political discourse on this is changing. So we'll see if this changes over the next couple of years. But we do also know that people have support for moving away, for this idea of moving away from fossil fuel heating. And most of that currently is driven by more general concerns around energy security and climate change or environment. But it's also really important to consider the actual adoption of these technologies and what drives them. And again, there's probably other research out there, but we found this really strong effect of, or potentially strong effect of the social neighbor, like the social network around you. A successful transition is going to need financial support, and we're seeing that already. At the time of the survey, subsidies were lower than they are now. So again, that might be changing attitudes. But what we haven't really seen is a kind of a change. What I would expect that we haven't seen a change in trust and how people are involved in some of that decision making. So that's something that is still, I think, to be investigated further. Right, that is it. Thank you very much.